The Hartwell Cafe was the kind of place that made you forget the rest of the world existed. Tucked away in a corner of the city's wealthiest district, its outdoor patio was shaded by wide umbrellas, the kind that seemed designed more for aesthetic than functionality. Marble-topped tables reflected the golden afternoon sunlight, and the faint hum of laughter and conversation filled the air. Every detail, from the carefully curated plants to the crystal-clear glasses on the tables, spoke of refinement and exclusivity.
For most people, a visit here was a once-in-a-lifetime splurge. For others, like Richard Collins, it was just Tuesday. Richard sat at a table near the edge of the patio, his chair angled slightly away from the rest of the diners. It was a deliberate choice. A man like him valued his space. At 55, Richard was the picture of success. His tailored suit, a deep navy that complemented his silver hair, made him look every bit the billionaire he was. His hands, free of the calluses that came with manual labor, rested lightly on a sleek tablet. Though the cafe buzzed with life around him, Richard seemed detached. His gaze flicked between his tablet and the cappuccino set before him, the foam still perfectly undisturbed. Business emails flooded his screen, each more urgent than the last. But for Richard, urgency was relative. Deals worth millions didn't stress him out. They were just another part of his daily routine. Across the street, life looked very different. Liam stood in the shadows of the wrought iron fence that encircled the cafe patio. At just 12 years old, he had already mastered the art of staying invisible. His hoodie, 3 sizes too big, hung loosely on his small frame, the frayed cuffs hiding his hands. His sneakers, worn down to nearly nothing, made no sound on the cobblestone street. To the patrons of the Hartwell Cafe, Liam was just another shadow, part of the scenery they had learned to ignore. But Liam wasn't here for their pity or their leftover pastries. He was here because something didn't feel right. It started earlier that afternoon. Liam had been sitting by the corner bakery, hoping for a kind stranger to toss him a roll or a few coins, when he saw a man in a gray uniform walk into the cafe. The man carried a package wrapped in plain brown paper, cradled in his arms like it was something fragile. Liam didn't think much of it at first. Delivery men were a common sight in this part of town. But there was something off about this one. The man's movements were hurried, his eyes darting around like he didn't want to be seen. He didn't stop to chat with anyone, didn't hand over a clipboard for a signature, and didn't even seem to acknowledge the staff. Instead, he placed the package near one of the patio tables, then walked away as quickly as he had come. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but Liam had spent enough time on the streets to know when something wasn't right. He had learned to read people, to pick up on the little things others missed, and something about that delivery man sent a shiver down his spine. For the next hour, Liam stayed close, keeping an eye on the package. It sat untouched, blending in with the elegance of the cafe. Patrons passed by without a second glance, too caught up in their own lives to notice. Now, Liam's attention was fixed on the man sitting closest to it, Richard Collins. From where he stood, Liam could see the billionaire's polished shoes and the faint glint of his watch as he reached for his tablet. The package sat just a few feet away, unassuming yet undeniably out of place. Liam's stomach growled, a sharp reminder of his own reality. He hadn't eaten since the night before, and his legs ached from standing so long. But he couldn't bring himself to leave. Something about that package kept pulling his focus. Across the patio, Richard was oblivious. His mind was on the latest numbers from his newest real estate project, a sprawling resort on a tropical island. The deal was nearly sealed, and all that was left was a quick review of the contract. He didn't notice the boy watching him. He didn't notice much of anything, really. Liam shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his nerves building. He had no idea what was in that package, but every instinct he had was screaming at him to do something. But what could he do? He was just a kid, standing outside a cafe filled with people who wouldn't give him the time of day. What were the chances that anyone would even listen to him, let alone believe him? Liam took a deep breath, trying to steady his thoughts. Maybe he was overreacting. Maybe it was just a harmless delivery, and he was letting his imagination get the best of him. But then he thought about the delivery man's nervous glances, the way he had practically run out of the cafe. No, something wasn't right. Richard picked up his cappuccino, the steam curling into the cool afternoon air. He glanced at the package for the first time, his eyes narrowing slightly. But then his tablet buzzed with a new email, and whatever thought had crossed his mind was gone. Liam's heart pounded as he stepped closer to the fence. He could feel the stares of passers-by, their judgmental glances weighing heavy on him. He didn't care. "Don't touch that!" The words burst out of him, louder than he had intended. The cafe fell silent. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Forks clattered against plates, and every head turned toward the boy standing outside the fence. Richard froze, his cappuccino halfway to his lips. His sharp blue eyes locked onto Liam, narrowing in confusion and irritation. "Excuse me?" Richard said, his voice calm but edged with annoyance. Liam's legs felt like lead, but he didn't back down. He stepped closer to the fence, gripping the cold metal bars. "Don't touch that package," he repeated, his voice steadier this time. Laughter rippled through the cafe. A woman at a nearby table leaned toward her companion, whispering something that made him smirk. "Go on, kid," someone called out. "This isn't the place for you." But Liam ignored them. His eyes were locked on Richard. "You don't understand," Liam said, his words rushing out. "I saw the guy who dropped it off. He was acting weird, like he didn't want anyone to see him. It's not right. Please, just don't touch it." Richard raised an eyebrow, setting his cappuccino down. "And why should I listen to you?" The question hung in the air, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Liam swallowed hard, his hands gripping the bars tighter. "Because I've been out here long enough to know when something's wrong," he said. "And I'm telling you, something's wrong with that package." The cafe patrons exchanged skeptical glances. To them, Liam was just another street kid looking for attention, or, at most, a handout. But Richard hesitated. There was something in the boy's eyes, something earnest, almost desperate. For the first time, he glanced back at the package, his irritation giving way to a flicker of doubt. And for the first time, Liam felt like someone might actually listen. The silence hung in the air like a taut wire. Liam's voice, though small and shaky, had cut through the comfortable hum of the cafe like a siren. All eyes were on him now. The boy behind the iron fence, gripping the bars as if he were holding on to his last shred of courage. Richard Collins sat motionless, his cappuccino untouched on the marble table. His piercing gaze shifted from Liam to the package resting just a few feet away. To anyone else, it was an ordinary delivery, wrapped in plain brown paper, sealed neatly with tape. But something about the boy's intensity had planted a seed of doubt in Richard's mind. "Who even let him stand there?" a woman muttered from a nearby table, brushing invisible crumbs off her designer coat. "This is ridiculous." "Probably looking for a handout," her companion said, smirking as he sipped his sparkling water. But Liam didn't flinch. His fists tightened around the bars, his knuckles white against the cold metal. "I'm not lying," he said, his voice rising above the murmurs. "The man who dropped that off, he was acting strange. You can't touch it. Please." Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression a mix of annoyance and curiosity. "And what exactly do you think is in it?" he asked, his tone sharp. Liam hesitated. The truth was, he didn't know. but his gut screamed that whatever it wasn't good. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice faltering for a moment, "but I know it's not what it looks like." Richard exhaled sharply, the sound more of a scoff than a sigh. He gestured toward the package with a casual wave of his hand. "It's probably just a delivery," he said. "Do you know where you are, kid? This is Hartwell Cafe, not some back alley." "Exactly," Liam shot back, surprising even himself with the force of his words. "That's why it's weird. Why would someone leave something like that here and just walk away? They didn't even stay to check if anyone noticed." The murmurs grew louder. Some of the patrons dismissed Liam outright, their whispers laced with disdain. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, glancing nervously at the package. "Should we call someone?" A waiter whispered to the manager, who was standing near the entrance with his arms crossed. "Call who?" the manager replied, his voice low and dismissive. "It's just some kid making a scene." But Richard's instincts, honed over decades of high-stakes business deals and negotiations, told him to pause. He wasn't a man who ignored red flags, no matter how small or improbable they seemed. And while Liam's ragged appearance made him an unlikely source of credibility, there was something about the boy's unwavering determination that gave Richard pause. "Fine," Richard said, setting his tablet down with a deliberate motion. He turned to Liam, his blue eyes narrowing. "Let's say, for argument's sake, that you're telling the truth. What exactly do you think I should do?" Liam blinked, caught off guard by the question. He had expected more ridicule, more dismissal. But now that Richard was listening, the weight of responsibility pressed down on him like a heavy stone. You should call someone," Liam said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "The police, or someone who can check it. Just don't touch it. Not until you know what's inside." Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His gaze shifted to the package once more. It sat there, unassuming and silent, yet suddenly charged with an air of danger. "Call the police for a package?" Richard said, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Do you have any idea how ridiculous that sounds?" "Not as ridiculous as ignoring me and getting hurt," Liam snapped, surprising both Richard and himself. His voice cracked slightly, but he pushed on. "If I'm wrong, fine, you can laugh at me all you want. But if I'm right—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The weight of those unspoken words hung in the air, heavier than anything else Liam could have said. The crowd shifted uneasily. A few patrons exchanged nervous glances, their earlier dismissal of the boy now tinged with doubt. "Maybe the kid's got a point," someone muttered. Richard straightened in his chair, his jaw tightening. He wasn't a man who liked being told what to do, especially not by a scrappy kid who looked like he hadn't had a proper meal in weeks. But Richard also wasn't a fool. He had built his empire by trusting his instincts, even when they defied logic. "All right," he said finally, his voice firm. "Let's put this to rest." He gestured to the cafe manager, who had been hovering near the entrance, watching the scene unfold. "You," Richard called out. "Open it." The manager hesitated, his eyes widening. "Sir, I don't think—" "I said open it," Richard repeated, his tone brooking no argument. The manager glanced nervously at the package, then at Liam, whose hands were still gripping the fence. The boy shook his head vehemently. "Don't!" Liam shouted. "You don't know what's in there. It could be dangerous." The manager froze, his hesitation only adding to the tension. Richard sighed, clearly impatient. He stood up, brushing off his suit jacket as he walked toward the package. "If no one else is going to do it, I will," he said. Liam's heart pounded in his chest. He felt like the world had slowed to a crawl, every second stretching into an eternity. "No!" he shouted, his voice breaking. "You can't. Please, just listen to me." But Richard was already reaching for the package. The cafe was silent now, every patron holding their breath as they watched. Liam's grip on the fence tightened until his fingers ached. He felt powerless, trapped behind the iron bars as the scene unfolded before him. Richard's hand hovered over the package for a moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then, with a quick motion, he began to peel back the tape. Liam squeezed his eyes shut, bracing himself for the worst. But nothing happened. No explosion, no gas, no sudden chaos. Richard tore away the last piece of paper, revealing a box. A plain, ordinary cardboard box. The tension in the cafe broke like a wave, replaced by relieved laughter and murmurs of embarrassment. "See?" someone said. "It was nothing." Richard turned to Liam, holding the box aloft like a trophy. "There," he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Mystery solved. Happy now?" But Liam wasn't looking at Richard. His eyes were fixed on the box, his expression unreadable. "Open it," Liam said quietly. Richard frowned. "What?" "Open it," Liam repeated, his voice steady but firm. "It's not what it looks like." For a moment, Richard hesitated. Then, with a shrug, he flipped open the lid. And froze. The color drained from his face as he stared into the box, his confident demeanor crumbling in an instant. The laughter and chatter around him stopped as everyone craned their necks, trying to see what he had found. Richard looked up, his eyes locking onto Liam's. For the first time, there was no skepticism, no condescension, only shock. "You were right," he whispered. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The crisp autumn breeze, the murmur of traffic in the distance, the clinking of glasses at nearby tables, it all faded into silence. All eyes were on Richard Collins as he stood frozen, staring into the open box. Liam's grip on the iron fence tightened, his knuckles turning white. He couldn't see what was inside, but the look on Richard's face told him everything he needed to know. Something was very, very wrong. "What is it?" a woman whispered, leaning forward in her chair. Richard didn't answer. Slowly, he set the box down on the table, his hands trembling ever so slightly. His piercing blue eyes flicked back to Liam, and for the first time, there was no arrogance in his gaze, only a mix of disbelief and unease. "You," Richard said, his voice low and firm. "How did you know?" Liam swallowed hard, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "I told you," he said, his voice steady despite the fear bubbling in his chest. "The guy who dropped it off, he was acting weird. I knew something wasn't right." The cafe patrons, who had moments ago been dismissing Liam as just another street kid, were now leaning in, their curiosity palpable. Even the manager, who had been skeptical of Liam's warnings, looked nervous. Richard reached into the box and pulled out a small, inconspicuous device. It was no bigger than a deck of cards, but its design was sleek and cold, with wires protruding from one side. A faint, steady beep emanated from it, almost too quiet to hear. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "Is that—" someone began, but their voice trailed off. Liam felt his stomach twist. He didn't know exactly what the device was, but he knew enough to realize it wasn't supposed to be there. "It's a tracker," Richard said finally, his voice tight. He turned the device over in his hands, examining it with the precision of someone who had seen too many high-stakes situations to dismiss this as a coincidence. "And not just any tracker. This is military grade." The murmurs grew louder. Patrons began glancing around, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion. "Why would someone leave that here?" a man asked, his voice tinged with panic. Richard didn't answer. He was already pulling out his phone, his fingers moving quickly across the screen as he called someone. "Yes, it's me," he said, his voice sharp. "I need security at Hartwell Cafe immediately. And call the authorities. This isn't a joke." The seriousness in his tone silenced the cafe once again. Even the most dismissive patrons were now sitting up straighter, their eyes darting between Richard and Liam. The boy stepped back from the fence, his instincts screaming at him to leave before things escalated further. But before he could take another step, Richard's voice cut through the tension. "Wait," he said, looking directly at Liam. Liam froze. "You're not going anywhere," Richard continued, his tone softer now, but no less commanding. "You knew about this before anyone else. I need to know how." Liam hesitated. He had spent most of his life trying to stay invisible, to avoid attention, but now the attention of everyone in the cafe was squarely on him. Liam began, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked down at his worn sneakers, the words catching in his throat. I've seen things, okay? I know when something's off." Richard's eyes narrowed. "That's not an answer," he said. "It's the truth," Liam snapped, surprising even himself. He looked up, his dark eyes flashing with frustration. "You think people like me don't notice things? We have to. It's how we survive." The cafe was silent again, the weight of Liam's words hanging in the air. Richard studied the boy for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Before he could respond, the sound of sirens pierced the air, growing louder as they approached the cafe. Moments later, 2 black SUVs screeched to a halt outside the iron gates. Several men in dark suits stepped out, their movements swift and purposeful. Richard waved them over. "Here," he said, handing the device to one of the men. "Figure out where this came from and why it's here. I want answers, and I want them now." The men nodded, their faces grim as they examined the tracker. One of them turned to Richard. "We'll need to evacuate the area, sir, just to be safe." Richard nodded, then turned to the patrons. "Everyone, please leave the premises," he said, his voice firm but calm. "This is a precaution, but it's better to be safe than sorry." The cafe erupted into motion as diners hurriedly gathered their belongings and made their way toward the exits. Some glanced nervously at Liam as they passed, their earlier contempt replaced by something resembling respect, or maybe even gratitude. But Liam stayed where he was, rooted to the spot. "Kid," Richard said, his tone softer now. "Come here." Liam hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to run, but something in Richard's voice made him stop. Slowly, he stepped forward, his small frame dwarfed by the towering figure of the billionaire. "You've got a sharp eye," Richard said, crouching slightly to meet Liam's gaze. "Most people wouldn't have noticed anything was wrong, but you did. Why?" Liam shifted uncomfortably, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his hoodie. "Like I said," he mumbled, I notice things." Richard studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. "Well, whatever the reason, you may have just saved my life, and maybe a lot of others too." The words hit Liam like a freight train. He had spent so much of his life being ignored, dismissed, or underestimated. To hear someone like Richard Collins acknowledge him, it was almost too much to process. Before he could respond, one of the security men returned. "Sir," he said, his voice low. "The tracker was active. Whoever planted it was monitoring this location. We're working on tracing the signal now, but we don't know how much time we have." Richard's expression darkened. He stood up, his jaw tightening as he processed the information. "Keep me updated," he said curtly. The man nodded and disappeared back toward the SUVs. Richard turned back to Liam. "You should come with me," he said. "It's not safe here." Liam blinked, his mind racing. "What? Why?" Because whoever did this might still be watching, Richard said, and I'm not about to let the kid who saved my life end up in trouble because of me. Liam hesitated. He didn't trust easily, and he certainly didn't trust people like Richard, people who had everything while he had nothing. But something about the billionaire's tone, his sincerity, made Liam pause. Okay, he said finally, his voice barely audible. Richard nodded. Good, let's go. As the two of them walked toward the waiting SUVs, Liam couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel something he had nearly forgotten. Hope. The ride in the black SUV was quiet, but the weight of the situation hung heavy in the air. Liam sat awkwardly on the edge of the leather seat, his fingers gripping the frayed hem of his hoodie. The luxury of the vehicle was a stark contrast to anything he had ever experienced, and he couldn't help but feel out of place. Next to him, Richard Collins stared out the tinted window, his sharp features etched with thought. For all his wealth and power, he looked less like the confident billionaire from earlier, and more like a man grappling with a reality he hadn't prepared for. Liam finally broke the silence. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard turned to him, his expression softening. "Now," he said, "we find out who did this, and why." The car pulled up to a private building on the edge of the city, a sleek glass structure that screamed exclusivity. Security guards greeted them at the entrance, and Liam found himself ushered into a conference room with walls lined with monitors and a large mahogany table at its center. Richard's security team was already there, their expressions serious as they analyzed the information from the tracker. Liam shifted nervously, unsure of his place in all of this. "Sir," one of the men said, turning to Richard, "we traced the tracker's signal. It was transmitting to an off-site server in the industrial district. Whoever planted it had a direct line to this cafe, likely monitoring your movements." Richard's jaw tightened. "Any idea who's behind it?" "Not yet," the man admitted, "but we're working on it. It seems targeted, possibly tied to one of your business dealings. We've already alerted the authorities." Liam watched the exchange in silence, feeling both overwhelmed and invisible. But then Richard turned to him, his blue eyes sharp but kind. "You said you noticed the delivery man acting strange," Richard began. "What exactly did you see?" Liam hesitated. He wasn't used to being asked for his opinion, especially not by someone like Richard. But he took a deep breath and recounted everything he remembered. The hurried movements, the nervous glances, the way the man had left without looking back. "It didn't feel right," Liam finished, his voice steady. "I don't know how to explain it. I just knew." Richard nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "You've got instincts," he said. "Good ones. Most people wouldn't have paid attention, but you did. You saw something no one else did." The compliment caught Liam off guard. He looked down, unsure how to respond. One of the security men interrupted. "Sir, the authorities are en route to the industrial district. They'll investigate the location and report back." Richard nodded, then turned back to Liam. "You're part of this now," he said, "and you deserve to know what's going on." Liam blinked in surprise. He wasn't used to being included in anything, let alone something this important. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Why do you care?" Richard's expression softened. "Because you saved my life today," he said simply, "and I don't take that lightly." The words hit Liam harder than he expected. For so long, he had been invisible, a kid surviving on the fringes of society, unnoticed and unimportant. But now, sitting in this room, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of worth. As the meeting continued, Liam found himself listening intently, absorbing every detail. The security team spoke of threats and precautions, of risks and responses, and though much of it went over his head, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had stepped into a world far beyond anything he had ever known. When the meeting ended, Richard stood and gestured for Liam to follow him. They walked down a quiet hallway, the soft hum of the building's ventilation the only sound between them. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Richard asked suddenly, glancing at Liam. Liam shrugged, his hands stuffed into his hoodie pockets. "I guess," he said, "it's just life." Richard stopped walking and turned to face him. "It shouldn't have to be," he said. "No one should have to live the way you've had to, especially not someone as sharp and brave as you." Liam looked away, his cheeks flushing. He wasn't used to compliments, and he didn't know how to handle them. "I've been where you are," Richard continued, his voice quieter now. "Not on the streets, but close. I know what it's like to feel like the world doesn't see you, like you don't matter. But trust me when I say, you do. You matter." Liam swallowed hard, his throat tight. He wanted to believe Richard, but years of being ignored and dismissed had left deep scars. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "You don't have to say anything," Richard said with a small smile. "Just let me help you." Liam's eyes narrowed slightly. "Why?" he asked again. "Why would you help someone like me?" "Because someone helped me once," Richard said simply, "and because it's the right thing to do." The sincerity in his voice caught Liam off guard. He had expected pity, maybe even guilt, but what he saw in Richard's eyes was something else entirely: respect. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the city lights flickered to life, Richard made good on his promise. He arranged for Liam to stay in a safe, comfortable place, with warm meals and a bed that didn't creak with every movement. It wasn't just a gesture, it was a new beginning. For the first time in years, Liam didn't have to worry about where his next meal would come from or where he would sleep, and though the adjustment was strange, he couldn't deny the small flicker of hope growing inside him. Richard, too, was changed by the events of the day. The experience had shaken him, forcing him to reevaluate the way he saw the world and the people in it. He couldn't stop thinking about Liam's bravery, his sharp instincts, and the courage it had taken for him to speak up when no one else would. In the days that followed, Richard used his resources to dig deeper into Liam's story. He learned of the hardships the boy had faced, the system that had failed him, and the resilience that had kept him going despite it all. And Richard made a decision. He would do more than just help Liam. He would use his influence to help others like him. He established a foundation dedicated to providing shelter, education, and opportunities for kids living on the streets. It was a small step, but it was one that Richard hoped would make a difference. As for Liam, his life was far from perfect, but it was better. He still carried the weight of his past, but now he had something he hadn't had in a long time: a future. And though he didn't say it out loud, he was grateful. Grateful for the chance to be seen, to matter, and to prove that even the smallest voices can make the biggest difference. Stories like Liam's remind us that courage and kindness can come from the most unexpected places. If this story inspired you, don't forget to subscribe for more.